None of them can stop.
The importance of the history of African peoples has never been more crucial for the development of the African mind than it is today as we move into another decade, the last decade of the 20th century, because we have to now think in terms of preparing the African mind and the African world for the 21st century. So these next 10 years are crucial in how we are going to be defined as African peoples into the next century or two. And it is obvious that we, as Africans, have to lay that foundation for ourselves. It is most important and crucial, then, that we have the full grasp and understanding of our history, because it is in our history that our present condition and our future can be found. That history is an enormity. In fact, as Dr. Clark says, you can't have the history of the world without African history. African history is at the center of world history, and this becomes important as we prepare for the 21st century. If African history is at the center of world history, then obviously there cannot be a meaningful 21st century without African peoples. The question becomes, how do African peoples wish to have their presence manifested in the 21st century? Will it be as doormats of the human family, as people who have been relegated to a bottom rung, or will it be as the vanguard of the human family, preparing the human family to live together on the planet into the 21st century? Our basic intention has been, in the lectures that we have been presenting, and in the work that has been done by the First World Alliance, by our brothers and sisters in Brooklyn, at the House of the Lord, at the various other forums around New York and around the country, our basic approach has been that African peoples have to move into their African mind and start preparing themselves for the 21st century. This means that the European mind, which is impacted upon us, has to be seriously understood. And in understanding it and its impact, we have to deal with that basic concept that I have been talking about for these previous lectures, the concept of socialization. How you get your beliefs, your role models, your patterns of behavior, how you become what you're going to become. And if we're going to prepare true Africans for the 21st century, then their socialization process has to be an Africanized socialization process. So all of us, especially those who have been around like myself for 52 years, going on 53 in a couple of weeks, all of us have to be prepared to re-socialize into a full African dimension. So the history becomes important because it is the key to our correct and proper socialization. Socialization becomes important because without an understanding of who you are as an African, you're not prepared to operate around what I call the African VIP, African values, African interests, and African principles. So if we're going into the 21st century, we have to clearly outline what those values, interests, and principles are. Because as the European imposed his mind on us collectively as Africans, he imposed his values, he had us operating around his interests, and he has raised up his principles for which we are asked to die for. So as we map out this next decade to prepare for the 21st century, we have to outline an African world agenda. And that's what these lectures will help us prepare to do. First and foremost, in order to appreciate the full dimension of Africanness and African peoples, we need to have in our minds a timeline of African history. Because if we're dealing with the enormous presence of Africans, we have to understand the depth of that presence and its fullness and the projection for it in the future. So I have mapped out 10 major areas of conflict as we deal with the enormity of African history. And these 10 major areas of conflict are key and crucial for us to understanding how important it is for us to take control of our history. My new saying now as I greet Africans is Hotep, and as I leave them, it is take control. And I picked this up from some youngsters at Kane College in New Jersey who had prepared an African family celebration, and the young lady was reading her statement and she was saying that we need to take control. So as I leave my brothers and sisters, I don't say take care or take it easy. I say take control. And we as Africans have to take control of our history so that we can impact on our socialization and re-socialize ourselves. So the full dimensions of this have to be understood, and we're running headlong into the inherited bodies of European world experience that have been imposed as part of white supremacy on the globe. The timeline will help us clarify this. But as we get into the timeline, we will deal with 10 major areas of enormous conflict that we have to be prepared to struggle around. Those 10 areas are, number one, that we're dealing with an African origin of humankind. And when we're talking about an African origin, there is a great wealth of scientific material that has been presented, particularly over the last 20 years and particularly over the last 10, cementing for all who wish to know the truth that Africa is the origin of humankind, and Africans are the origin of that humanity. So if we're going to say, for example, as scholars are now saying, that there is no such thing as multiple races of humankind, I agree. As Dr. Diop and others would agree, that there is but one race of humankind, and that's the human race, and that race is African. Everything else is a offshot or a mutation off of the African. So that when we run into our history and deal with the Africans and civilization, we run, number one, headlong into the question of origin of humankind. And Dr. Diop and others, Dr. Ben and our other scholars, have established for us a scientific premise which we refer to as the monogenetic origin of humanity, the African monogenetic origin of humankind. We all come out of that African gene bank millions of years ago. But this article in Newsweek is very important because many scientific minds have accepted the African origin of humankind going back millions of years to that Great Lakes region of the continent, where the Great Lakes of the African watershed, the Congo River watershed, and the watershed coming from the mountains of Ethiopia and Tanzania, this Great Lakes region becomes the birthplace of humankind in this enormous geological development called Ogilvy Gorge. Humankind marched down the Nile. And so, in establishing an African scientific presence of humanity, we have to be familiar with the African geography and African origins in the center of Africa. And we have to be familiar with what they call paleontology, the different evolutionary processes of the human species, the various hominids that developed, the man and woman-like early humankind. And what Dr. Diop and others have established is that the first 3 of the 6 early human beings never left Africa. The last 3 eventually left Africa and peopled other parts of the globe. The first 3 moved freely throughout the continent, into the south and into the west and into the eastern and northern parts of the continent. But eventually, the last 3 were able to migrate out of Africa across this stretch where Egypt and Palestine link into the Eurasian domains. And of course, the African was able to march across his beautiful continent and then cross this small body of water at the Straits of Gibraltar and travel into Europe. So by various means, the African was able to people Asia and the so-called Middle East and the European continent. So the last 3 hominids, or early humanity, was able to march out of Africa. And so we still maintain the monogenetic African thesis. But the interesting thing was, and that's millions of years ago, so if you're talking about an African timeline, you have to talk about that timeline going back millions of years. But the interesting thing is that the European was able to postulate that although early humanity has its roots in Africa, because the scientific fossil remains have established that, he was able to postulate, hypothesize, come up with various theses and theories that modern man had its origin, however, in Europe. And somehow or other there were several branches of humankind, one an old branch in Africa, but a more modern branch emerged in Europe. That's the polygenetic thesis. In other words, several roots of genesis of the human family. And that thesis allowed for the Europeans to postulate that this later man that they originated out of was that man which developed a large brain, and was that man which became modern man. And so he was able to stamp on the human family the concept of the Cro-Magnon. Cro-Magnon man, the large brain modern man, and it is from this modern man, Homo sapiens sapien, that modern humankind developed, particularly the European branch that's supposedly superior. But unfortunately, as there is this enormous explosion of information, and that's why we have to form our study group so we can tap into it and keep our eyes open vigilantly and study and restudy and reread even previous works. Fortunately, this explosion of information has established that various scientific finds, molecular biology and other modern means of scientific research has established that Cro-Magnon man, or Homo sapiens sapien, also has his and her origin in Africa. In fact, this article in Newsweek doesn't deal with the old humanity, which goes back millions of years in Africa. This particular article is important and crucial because it deals with modern man, Homo sapiens sapien. And it points out that modern man has his origin also in Africa. The research was conducted on more than 100 or so of the women from around the world, from the different groups, and their placentas, etc., were tested. And with DNA and RNA research, they were able to take the human tree and unveil it and take it back through time to an African woman in Africa, East Africa, the birthplace of humankind, 200,000 plus years ago. So now the earliest finds of Cro-Magnon men, or Homo sapiens sapien, have been found in Africa. So scientific information has fairly put to rest this whole question of the African origin of humankind. We come from one human tree, and that's the African tree. In fact, Dr. Diop, in his book, The African Triumph that he completed with Civilization and Barbarism, Dr. Diop talks about Glover's law, which relates to mammals in the sun developing melanin to resist the ultraviolet rays of the sun. And the human family is a part of the mammal family. And so clearly, if humankind existed for any length of time back into antiquity, for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years, even millions of years, that existence was in the sun, and that existence had to have been around a black skin or a melanized epidermal skin pigment. So clearly, the scientific data is establishing the African origin. But we have a problem, because not only do we have the myths and misconceptions about a European origin and the falsification of history around those things, but we also have our Judeo-Christian heritage, which, although it is not scientific and not historic, has left an enormous mark on thinking of the world, that somehow or other a Garden of Eden is the story of humankind. But we say, even within the religious and spiritual traditions, if there was a Garden of Eden, that Garden of Eden was not by the nature of ecological development in Europe, in the ice. It had to be in the sun, and that most likely would have been in Africa. So even if we talk about the religious traditions of the origin of humankind, we've got to go back into the African continent. And even if we talk about the Judeo-Christian religious traditions of humankind and Islamic tradition of humankind, we have to go back to Africa because Africa is the birthplace of those great religious systems. And so that Europe certainly was not the first Christian nation or where Judaism had its birthplace. Clearly, the traditions of the churches themselves and the religious systems themselves point them to the African continent as the foundation for their culture and development. So whether we're talking about the biblical tradition of origin, we have an African origin. Whether we're talking about the scientific tradition of origin, we have an African origin. But the interesting thing is the European has constantly falsified the history. And that's one of the things that we have to begin to seriously look at. Martin Brunel, in his book, Black Athena, talks about the falsification of European history over the last couple of hundred years in order to create a unique Greece, and a unique Greek miracle. And what he establishes for all the world to see is that this falsification took place because the European scholars, having built their wealth and their cultural rebirth on African enslavement, the European scholars were not prepared to deal with the African origin and foundations of Greek civilization. So they falsified history. And that same falsification can be found in the Europeans' attempt to deal with human origins. Trying to give the Europeans some ancient foundations, hundreds of thousands of years ago, the falsification by the scholars has been very real. This particular book that I'm holding is entitled The Piltdown Inquest by Charles Binderman. And this is very interesting because it deals with that early European find. When I was a youngster in school, we had to learn about Peking man and Java man and Neanderthal man. And these were the early humankind. And all of a sudden, here was Piltdown man. And of course, he was more significant than any of the others because he was found in Europe, in England no less. And so this Piltdown man was postured as the head of the human family because his brain capability was larger. They had this whole science, or pseudoscience, they developed of chronology. In other words, the larger brain size meant that you were a superior being. So the European had postured this, and for 100 or more years he had created this pseudoscience of brain size. All of that now is being thrown out by scientific finds. Latest scientific finds, when they start to dig in Africa, when Africans start to dig for latrines or a place to go to bathroom, they always dig up something important, either a tomb or some gold or some bones. Whichever they dig up, there's a richness in terms of the human history or human wealth. So as Africans dig, and some African digging discovered some ancient bones in East Africa, they found the skeletal remains of a human young man, 13 years old. They dated it, and it was carbon dated, and potassium, the new potassium way of finding out dating, going back 1,000,000+ years. And they tested the size, the brain size of this young man, and his brain size was almost the modern brain size. In other words, this find alone throws out that whole pseudoscience of brain size that the European had postured his superiority on. So as the Africans began to discover more about the continent, we're putting to rest these myths of the Europeans. But this is important because the European actually, and this is a copy of Piltdown Man with one of the scientists holding Piltdown Man. This is a copy of a modern human brain and an ape's jaw that the European scientists put together, and they put it in a pit and put some gravel and tar over it to give it some age to try to give Europe ancient roots. And so this was done in about 1908. And for 50 years or more, Piltdown Man stood at the head of the human family, and that puts the Europeans at the head of the human family. But in the 50s, people began to scientifically question these things and put these finds to scientific tests. And they discovered that European science has actually falsified the history, that they had actually taken a modern brain and put an ape's jaw on to give it an ancient fossil find in order to give the European ancient roots. Most of the evidence to date tells us that there are no ancient roots of the European family. The European family, and just the whole aspect of melanin, would tell us that the European family could not have existed on the planet for any serious length of time because you could not function in the rays of the sun without melanin. And clearly, because of the European world experience has been in the ice, it is a reason to explain how an African human presence in Europe could have mutated over thousands of years through the loss of its melanin into the present-day European. But that is an area of serious research that our scientists need to be encouraged to go into. And I think Elijah Muhammad, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and others were opening up this area. Where did the European originate from? And of course, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad did not have the scientific data and information, but I'm sure his grandchildren and others will become those scientists who need to look at these questions so we can put to rest how the European actually evolved. Quite clearly, he was not a chosen member of the human family. If anybody was chosen to lead the human family and to open up to the human family the enlightenment of the universe, it was Africans. So number one in the areas of conflict is the African origin, and we have to go back millions of years. Number two is the African evolution of society. And when we're talking about the African evolution, we're talking about that last 100,000 years of human development where there was this rapid, almost revolutionary change where humankind and the large brain African began to grasp the significance of the laws of nature and began to develop cultures and civilizations around those laws of nature, began to domesticate animals, domesticate plants, began to live in settled communities. As Dr. Diop says in his great book, Civilization and Barbarism, during this period of time, that evolution of humanity took place in Africa around the concept of incest taboo. The Africans somehow, in studying the laws of nature, finding that if you married into a bloodline of the same bloodline, that there were problems. So the Africans developed the concept of incest taboo, marrying outside of a particular bloodline. So Africans within one particular bloodline of one African woman became part of a clan, and you needed this clan to maintain its cohesiveness, but when it came to marriage, that clan married outside of it into another clan. And so the early human development around incest taboo led to the settlement, communities settling together for purposes of marriage and interreaction. So African scientific information now has established the African origin of humankind, the African evolution of society. The first tool makers were the Africans. The first to study the stars were the Africans. The first to develop a notation of mathematical formulation seems to be the Africans, because the early find found in the Zaire, the old day Congo, the Ishango people had among their cultural artifacts the Ishango bone, which is notations of a mathematical nature, a counting nature going back 9,000 or 8,000 BC. The oldest notation of a mathematical nature found in the human family. Not found in Europe, not found in China, not found in Arabia, but found in the heart of Africa, in the lake region, the forest region of Zaire, which is in the geographical heart of Africa. So that clearly Africans were beginning to study the laws of nature, study the planets, and study the stars, began to harmonize and learn to develop agriculture, learn to develop settled communities, learn to develop a science of living together. And that evolution was 100,000 years ago. So now you see, number one, the African origin millions of years ago. Number two, the African evolution 100,000 years ago. And number three, the African cradle of civilization. And that again becomes very important. And we're still on the African continent. We're not talking about Europeans in any serious way. An African origin in the Great Lakes region and an African evolution stemming out of the Great Lakes region into other parts of Africa. And as Africans moved into other parts of Africa and lived in settled communities, learned to study the stars, harmonized with the laws of the universe, learned to domesticate animals, learned to domesticate plants, they found, for example, the earliest domestication of plants to date in the human family was in the highlands of Kenya, 15 to 16,000 years ago. Previously, they thought that it was in Mesopotamia, in the Tigris-Euphrates area, 7 or 8,000 BC, that the earliest domestication of animals took place. That same process of 7 or 8,000 years ago witnessed the domestication of agriculture, so the historians had said. But now the latest finds have established domestication of animals in this early date in Kenya 15 to 16,000 years ago, and the domestication of wheat and other cereals in the Nile Valley, 13,000 BC. So this early date of 7 or 8,000 BC for Mesopotamia has now been greatly extended back into the past around dates found in the African continent. So clearly Africa is not only the origin of humankind in the Olduvai Gorge in the Great Lakes region, but the evolution of the foundations of human culture and civilization scientifically are being established in the African continent. So it's clear that we have a major task, because most of the European historians of significance in the early dates said that Africa had no history. Their later scientists established for themselves that Africa developed nothing in terms of scientific achievement. And they even relegated the African human species to a subspecies of the human family, and Africans were not considered human. So we've got to reverse that history and turn history upside down. So when we're talking about getting into our history, we're talking about headlong clash into the established doctrines of white imperialism and white nationalism and white egocentric value systems that have been perpetuated by this culture in their greatest institutions, in their greatest technological inventions, the cinemas, and now the videos. This myth of white supremacy is so deep into their psyche, we've got to work double time, triple time, in order to expel it from the human family. But quite clearly, as we look at Africa and we talk about an African timeline, we want to go back in time millions of years to the African origin of humankind. And then we want to go back in time, number two, to the evolution of society, to an African evolution 100,000 years ago. And then there is a peculiar ecology of Africa that helped to lay the foundations for the cradle of civilization. And even though there have been cradles of civilizations around the river valleys of the world, the Tigris-Euphrates, the Indus Valley in India, the Yellow River Valley in China, the rivers and lakes of the Americas, civilizations have flourished. There is one sustaining civilization process that seems to have followed the Nile Valley. As humankind evolved here, in its origin, as humankind laid the foundations for culture and civilization in a wider range of Africa, agricultural development and animal domesticated production took place. Then there's this peculiar ecology of the Nile where the foundations were laid for culture and civilization. That peculiar ecology was built around the overflow of the Nile River Valley. That the waters from the highlands of Ethiopia and Kenya, and from the great lake swells and river swells of Central Africa, that this water, and from the Sud, this swampy land in Sudan, these great waters, washing the rich soil of Africa down through the Nile, was able to pass down through this enormous cultural belt, and when they overflowed, for 4 months, the earth was fertilized, and they laid the foundation for potential agricultural development. So African culture moving down the Nile from the highlands of Ethiopia and Kenya through the watered areas of the Sudan on into Nubia in southern Sudan, southern Egypt and northern Sudan, Nubia here, and then on into Egypt itself. This special ecology laid the foundations for the cradle of civilization. And so it's important for the Africans to establish their origin of humankind, their evolution of society, and also their cradle of civilization. And what I'm beginning to seriously learn is that while this African cradle was being developed in the South, and I refer to that as the Sun People's development, Dr. Diop refers to it as the Southern cradle, and he postured a Northern cradle. And the European experience comes out of the Northern cradle, and the African experience and Southern Asian experience comes out of the Southern cradle. I also postured the difference in ecology. The ecology of beneficence and the goodness of the universe and God comes out of the African ecology, and the ecology of deprivation and a deficient ecology is that which represents the European experience. And so we talk about two cradles of development. We're not talking about millions of years ago. We're not talking about hundreds of thousands of years ago. We're talking about that period of 50 to 60,000 years when the ice dominated Europe, and that this was the result. This particular article in Newsweek refers to the Ice Age in Europe, and this article is entitled "The Way We Were, Our Ice Age Heritage, Language, Art, Fashion, and the Family." And it's a very intriguing article because it comes out of an exhibit that was at the American Museum of Natural History dealing with the European Ice Age experience 20, 30, 40,000 years ago. And the interesting thing about this is that as we went down to see the exhibit, the major thing in the exhibit was this particular item here, which may be hard for you to see, but this is an image of mammon bones that have been put together to make a shelter. And the subtitle is "A Condo on the Russian Plains." And I call it the Bone Motel that the Europeans put together for development and for survival. But this is what I meant by the ecology of survival and the deficient ecology of the northern cradle. These bones put together was considered an achievement. This was the biggest thing in that exhibit. The monumental achievement of the Africans is their monumental building to their God concept seen by the pyramids and seen by their great temples. And so I think it's important for us to appreciate that. In fact, when we make the contrast between African development in the sun and European development in the ice, the value system of caring and sharing that comes out of the sun, the value system of what I call the communal, cooperative, and collective development, as opposed to the value system of the ice. And I've given it that nomenclature because ice fits what I want to say is the value system. It's a crass individualism, taking care of me, even in neglect of your family, and a competitivism, an amoral competitivism for C. So you have I for individualism, C for competitivism, and E for exploitation, super exploitation, exploitation of by any means necessary. So it's this value system of ice which contrasts the value system of the sun, which becomes the important foundation for our understanding of human history. So if we look at a timeline, the timeline has to be in relationship to what happened in the ice, in the northern cradle, as opposed to what happened in the sun, in the southern cradle. And Dr. Du Bois, just like Dr. Ben and Dr. Clark and the others, has postured this relationship, that civilization developed in the southern cradle and barbarism developed in the northern cradle. So this important dichotomy between north and south becomes important because it tells us, in the dimension of historical development, what was happening in the caves of Europe and those areas where the ecology was not favorable, and what was happening in the sun of Africa and the river valleys in southern Asia and in the Americas, where civilization was developed by sun people. Now, it's important for us to have documentation from European sources, because even though our great African scholars like Dr. Diop and like Dr. Chancellor Williams, who wrote this enormous book on the destruction of African civilization, the great issues of race from 4,500 BC to 2000 AD, Dr. Chancellor Williams, our great professor from Howard University, and even though brothers such as Professor John Jackson has written this enormous book called The Introduction to African Civilization, which has an enormous foreword by Dr. John Henry Clark, and other scholars have laid down that this African origin of humanity and the African evolution of society and African high culture and civilization in the Nile is important. We've got to go to European sources in order to be able to support it. One sentence from a European is worth 1,000 books by Africans. That's in racist thinking. So from this book, A History of the Modern World, by Dr. Palmer and Dr. Colton, we have taken from page 3 an important statement, and that statement is from their chapter concerning ancient times, Greece, Rome, and Christianity. And it reads, under the subtitle, Before the Greeks, the Near East, Europeans were by no means the pioneers of human civilization. Let me read that again. In fact, I think African youngsters, in fact, all youngsters around the world should be raised on these statements. If we woke up in the morning, we told our youngsters, Europeans were by no means the pioneers of human civilization, I think a lot of things would happen to them good. Half of man's recorded history had passed before anyone in Europe could read or write. See, that's important for our youngsters to understand. Half of man's recorded history, when you're talking about a timeline, you're talking about thousands of years ago when humankind established writing, half of it had passed before the European could read or write. And then he goes on to say, the priests of Egypt began to keep written records between 4000 and 3000 BC. But more than 2,000 years later, the poems of Homer were still being circulated in Greek city-states by word of mouth. In other words, the greatest and earliest writing of a European is Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and was written around 750, 800 BC. And before that, it was told in oral history. Whereas Africans had the writing systems in place thousands of years before that. So there is no question of who established culture and civilization if you have these facts. In fact, the Africans were writing a medical book, the Epirus Medical Papyrus, 2000 BC. They were writing books on mathematics, etc. We have some documentation here concerning the mathematical papyrus called the Rin Mathematical Papyrus, or the Moscow Papyrus, which was written a couple thousand years BC, which actually deals with mathematical problems of geometry and trigonometry, etc., that the Africans had mastered thousands of years before the Greeks. So there's no question of who were the fathers and mothers of mathematics, etc. These are the various problems that the Africans have in their papyrus concerning mathematical achievement. So it's important for us to have these documentations so we can put to rest the question of where the European comes in and where the African comes in. But let me finish reading this statement because I think it's very important. Shortly after 3000 BC, while the pharaohs were building the first pyramids, Europeans were creating nothing more distinguished than huge garbage heaps. Now, if Jeffries had said something like that, people would have said he's crazy. These are the European PhDs talking about the history of the world. And they go on to say, ironically, like the pyramids, they still endure and are known to archaeologists as kitchen middens. In other words, the archaeological record of the Africans is in their monumental building, and other Sun people in their temples, in their monumental building. The archaeological record of the European is in his garbage outside of his caves and in structures such as this bone motel. And how can you even think to compare a bone motel or a condo on the Russian plains with the great temples that the Africans built to their god concepts? But this has happened. And as a result, people have been attempting to denigrate Africans to such an extent that they still maintain this myth about the Europeans and what they were doing. That my basic contention is we have to go for the jugular. Once you have the documentation and the information, you have to lay it out there in such a scientific, rational fashion that you destroy the Europeans and their pretense. So even though we might say they were putting together some bones in the caves to build their shelters, French scientists have said much more was going on in those caves. And it was not just a question of Ice Age heritage, language, art, fashion, and the family. Something more important was going on. Number one, there was this male domination because you were in a survival environment and the physical strength of the male prevailed. So this domination of a male-oriented culture, a war culture, a greed culture, a culture of dog-eat-dog emerged. But it wasn't just a question of dog-eat-dog, it was a question of humans eating humans. And when we really want to go for the jugular, we have to deal with the truth. Brother Reggie, one of our young men in the Sons of Africa, was at my house, and he knew about the exhibit at the American Museum of Natural History because we had gone to it with the Sons of Africa. And then when he was at the house, he was flipping through one of my Omni magazines, and he discovered on about page 66 that an article by French scientists, which is very important. And this is the Omni magazine. Unfortunately, this was the red page in Omni. This is January 1987. It was the red page, so it doesn't photograph very well. But what I'm showing you are bones. And these were bones studied by French scientists coming out of the caves of Europe 6,000, 7,000 years ago. And what it says is, in subtitle, Stone Age Cannibals. And what they have established is that the Europeans in those caves were involved in systematic cannibalism. In fact, the article says by these French scientists from the French Academy of Science that historically people have had ritual cannibalism. And some people have been caught in a situation where there was a dire need and cannibalism result. But the Europeans may be the only people who have been involved in a systematic process of cannibalism as part of the food supply. How did they reach this conclusion? They tested the bones in the caves and the bites on the bones in the caves. And they found the same microscopic bites on the animal bones that they found on human bones. And these French scientists concluded that the Europeans were involved in cannibalism in their cave existence in Europe. So that's why when Diop talks about civilization or barbarism, we need to understand the significance of that. And we need to understand it even more because the European has stamped African peoples with this mark of cannibalism when in fact Omni magazine, pointing to the work of the French scientists in the French Academy, has revealed, again, one of those explosive documents that the European was involved in systematic cannibalism. So that's why it's important for us to have our timeline and to have this grasp of history so we can turn history upside down. And when we do, we will find an enormity that the European has falsified the history of the world in order to put himself in an undeserved spot of dominating the world. But as we go further in our timeline, and our brother Asa, when we're talking about the African cradle of civilization, we're talking about 10,000 years ago in the Nile, 10,000 years of development in the Nile. And our brother Asa Hilliard has developed a timeline of enormous significance in dealing with the Kemetic development. And that timeline is part of his cultural package, and we have it here. The Dr. Hilliard, in putting together these documents for us, talks about a cultural Kemet. And when you're talking about a cultural Kemet, you're talking about 10,000 years ago. And you're talking about a political Kemet, you're talking about 5,000 years ago. In other words, 3000 BC is when the dynasties of the north and the south were united into the empire that became the empire of the pharaohs. But actually the political development goes back a couple thousand years before that. The finds in Nubia, the lost pharaohs of Nubian finds, which we have included as part of your packet, established that before the pharaohs of Egypt unified Upper and Lower Egypt into dynastic rule, there was development in Nubia for 1,000 or more years around kingship. And the finds in Nubia established that 5,000 years ago, the incense burner has on it, and I'll show you an image of the incense burner discovered among the 3,000 or 3,500 items found in the 33 royal tombs discovered in Nubia. The incense burner has on it some of the major symbols of later developments in Egypt. The seret, symbolizing the kingship, the symbol of the palace, the white crown, the symbol of rulership, the royal barges, etc. And symbols that later became the hieroglyphs. So obviously, Nubia is the mother of Egypt. So when Dr. Ben wants us to understand this, he talks about the development in Egypt as the zenith of earlier developments out of Nubia. And a number of our other scholars, like Dr. Chancellor Williams, Dr. George Jackson, speak about Ethiopia, the mother of Egypt, or Egypt, Ethiopia's oldest daughter. In other words, establishing that earlier foundation in Nubia. So when we're talking about this Kemetic timeline, we're talking about developments that took place after a foundation had been laid in Nubia for the religion, for the science, for the mathematics, for the writing, for the political structures, for the philosophy, for the ethics, for the God concepts. And then when you can talk about the unity of the North and the South, you're talking about 3000 BC. And in what Dr. Hilliard does very brilliantly is he calls that the age, the first golden age of Kemet, not of the Nile Valley. The first golden age of Kemet, which is that zenith that occurred after developments in Nubia. The first golden age of Kemet is called the Pyramid Age. And quite clearly, in order to build pyramids of the size that the Africans built it, either the step pyramid of Saqqara built by Imhotep, or the later Great Pyramid built by the builders for Khufu, you had to have 1,000 or 2 years of development before the science and mathematics and the technology could be devised to build something as the pyramids, but the Great Pyramids of Giza. But that first dynasty, that first golden age, is referred to by our brother Asa as the Great Golden Age of the pyramids. And the protection of the pyramids, the second Great Pyramid, was built by Khafra. And Khafra was the son of Khufu, and his image is carved for humanity, for eternity, in the image of the Sphinx. And clearly, the Sphinx image of Khafra is an African image. In fact, tradition has it that it was so African that it shook up the Turks when they came into the Nile and they attempted to destroy the face, and it shook up the expedition of Napoleon that came into the Nile in 1799 after the so-called American Revolution and the so-called French Revolution, and they attempted to destroy the face. So the nose has been damaged, but clearly it's an African nose that was damaged and an African image. The first great structure of the ancient world is the pyramid of Saqqara. And this pyramid was commanded and built in the name of the pharaoh Zoser, built by the great genius of the ancient world, the first person to emerge out of the midst of the ancient past as a human figure of enormous proportion, the multi-genius Imhotep. And Imhotep designed the step pyramid, and the step pyramid is more than a step pyramid, it's a whole cultural university learning center. Around that pyramid is an enormous concentration of buildings that were part of the learning center and educational system of ancient Kemet, the first university to be systematically developed that we have knowledge of, and the ruins are still there. But this African image, with the nose and the mouth, clearly is of that great pharaoh who commanded that Saqqara pyramid be built. So this establishes the African origin of the early dynasties of Kemet. And you can contrast these African images with their large and full lips, their plentiful noses, their African hairstyles, etc. You can contrast these with 3,000 years later when the Greeks and Romans dominated, and you had their images carved in wood and on papyruses. But they definitely were not the originators or the people who took the culture to its height. They were people who were part of what we call the stolen legacy, invaders that inherited this greatness of Egypt. So these images become very important for us to have. And this is the Pyramid Age, in which you have the great pharaoh of the third dynasty, Amenhotep, clearly an African image. And of course, over here with the great Ankh symbols, you have Khepra-Ka-Re, who was called Sanseret of the 12th dynasty. Again, a renewal of the golden ages of Africa in the 12th dynasty, and that is dated by Professor Hilliard at 2000 BC. The Pyramid Age being 3000 BC, the age of the second golden age, 2000 BC, and Asa refers to that, Dr. Hilliard refers to that as the literary age. That's the age in which the Rin mathematical papyrus, the Epirus medical papyrus, the Turin medical papyrus, and the various other books dealing with the philosophy, mathematics, the morality and ethics of the Africans became important. In fact, it became so important that it began to pass on to other peoples and help them develop. One of the great books out of this tradition, in terms of literary tradition, was the pyramid text being put into the so-called Book of the Dead, the Book of the Coming Forth by Day and by Night, which becomes one of the first known religious texts or Bibles of the ancient world. So that second golden age, Dr. Hilliard refers to as the literary age, in which the writings of the Nile Valley Africans became part of the human family's literary tradition. And the ironic thing is, the Greeks don't have writing at this time. The Germans don't have writing at this time. The French don't have writing at this time. The Scandinavians don't have writing at this time. And Africans in Ethiopia, in Nubia, and in Egypt itself are writing books about their philosophical, moral, ethical, mathematical, and scientific knowledge. And then, unfortunately, you get the invasions. And Dr. Chancellor Williams has documented in his book, The Destruction of Black Civilization, that you can date the invasions of Africa from the High Sox invasion, 1750 BC, where for 200 years, part of the Nile Valley was dominated by these invasions from the Indo-European areas, Asia Minor, if you will. But fortunately, Africans from the south, as has been the case in the previous rule, in other words, when we talk about the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt with the Narma palette, and that's what you have here on this image. Those are both sides of the Narma palette. It depicts historically the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, the invasion of Africans from the south, unifying the whole valley in their under their rule, and flourishing under the Pyramid Age. Then you have a period of intermission, an intermediary period where things fall into disorder, but then coming up from the south again come these African pharaohs, Senuseret and others, and they restore unity and establish another golden age that lasts 400 years, just as the previous golden age lasts over 500 or 600 years. Then you have the High Sox invasion, and for a couple hundred years these foreigners dominated the northern parts of the Nile Valley. But then again, up from the south comes the Africans, with the dynasties established by Amos and others, the family of the Tutmosis, and eventually the family of the Amenaphis that produced Akhenaten and his father Amenaphis III and Queen T. And they reestablish a third golden age in what Asa, Dr. Hilliard, refers to as the Temple and Imperial Age. And this was the age that they stopped building the pyramids. They continued to write extensively, but they started building the great temples and their tombs in the south around Thebes. And across from the city of Thebes is the valley of the kings and the valley of the queens and the valleys of the nobles, where the dead took place, where the burials took place, and their mortuary temples. Now the beautiful thing was Thebes, at this juncture, becomes the greatest city of the ancient world. And this enormity of Thebes was recognized by Homer in the Iliad or Odyssey. He refers to the greatest city of the ancient world being Thebes, or Waset, the city of 100 gates. And Dr. Chancellor Williams points out in his book that Thebes was an enormous development, and it is the major center and beginning of black history and black domination of world history in its fullest dimensions of what we call civilization. So we need to understand the importance of Thebes as an enormous center. And the monuments of Thebes are there for all to see. You have the great temple complex of Karnak, the greatest tribute to the God concept in the history of the world. And then a short distance from it, a mile from it, connected by a row of sphinx, you have the great university temple of Wa'at, which was the Ifrit temple where the learning processes for the leadership of the ancient world took place. And it is in that temple the Great Lodge of Luxor, that the Greeks and others desired to go to learn, and the foundations of mathematics and science that they contributed, they learned from the Africans. In fact, there's an enormous book called The Stolen Legacy, which we need to refer to at this particular point, because the development which we refer to as the Greeks has its root in Africa. In other words, the great achievement of the Greeks in science, mathematics, philosophy, art, and culture has its root in Africa. In fact, Greek philosophy was considered a foreign philosophy. Many of the Greek philosophers were killed or exiled or had to commit suicide because they were teaching a foreign philosophy. This book by George D.M. James details what was the legacy that the ancient Greeks obtained. Now, it's important at this point to establish where do the ancient Greeks come into this timeline. And we really haven't gotten to them seriously yet. When Thebes was established as a major university center a couple of 2000 BC and 1500 BC, the Greeks were not involved in the process. The Greeks did not come until another 1,000 years in any serious numbers to relate to the African development in the Great Temple Age, the Third Golden Age. The Greeks came, in fact, in the Fourth Golden Age, after the Africans had thrown out the Hyssopes and the people had come up from the south, almost the family of the 18th dynasty, and they had united the two lands again, and they established a golden age. And the Africans began to realize that if they're really going to keep a sustained civilization, which they did for 500 years, from 550 BC to 1100 BC, if they're going to keep that, then they've got to go out to the other parts of the areas, Asia, and even the islands of the Mediterranean, to spread their culture and civilization and tell people how you organize a society, how you learn to live harmoniously. And the lodges became a key to that. In other words, the concept of the Society of Secrets, where the leadership was trained to be the trustee of the people, became the key to spreading African culture out into Asia, into the Indus Valley, out into the so-called Asia Minor, up into the Mediterranean. And those lodges became the important centers. But, of course, people wanted to go to the source. And the greatest minds wanted to go to the Nile itself to sit at the feet of Africans. And this began to occur in an important period after 1000 AD. 1000 AD, you get invasions from into the Nile being pushed back. And as a result of these invasions, first by the Libyan Sea people, then by the Assyrians, you get people coming up from the south again to reestablish African greatness. And this fourth great golden age was reestablished by the Nubians coming up from Kush and Meroe around the family of the Piankes, the great pharaoh of the south, and his relatives Shabaka, Taharka, and Shabaka that carried on his work. And so this revision age took place, or revival age took place, when they refurbished the Nile Valley culture and civilization, reestablished the truth of the ancients. And it was at that time that the Greeks came into the Nile, when these dominant Nubian leaders were on the throne. And one of the important things that they did establish as part of that revival was the famous Shabaka stone. And that Shabaka stone was that particular African moral ethical tradition around the creation of humankind, the development of the God concept, moral and ethical codes that became the Memphite theology. And the Memphite theology laid the foundation for much of the Judeo-Christian heritage that we now enjoy, coming out of early Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. So we need to talk about four golden ages, and it's in that fourth golden age that the Greeks had their presence felt. In the third golden age, the age of the temple building, the age of Amenhotep III and his great wife Queen T, and the age of Akhenaten, his son, and his great wife Nefertiti, and the age of Tutankhamun, that was the age in which the ancient Hebrews came into the Nile. And they became Africanized and developed what I call the African synthesis that became the early Hebrew religion. And many people will say that those early Hebrews were Africanized people to start off with. But what they were able to put together was an African synthesis of values from the Nile Valley to produce what became Judaism. That occurred in the golden age, the third golden age. The Greeks actually appear in the fourth golden age, and that's the period in which the Greek golden age has its roots. And the date that you can, it's important for us to have these African dates, because the date that they like to date Greek civilization and culture is 500 BC to 300 BC, and then something marvelous happened. A miracle took place in Greece, and these Greeks became the dominant factor in the history of the world in terms of culture and civilization. And they can't explain this miracle. It's just the genius of white folks. Well, Dr. Ben explains the miracle in his book, Africa, the Mother of Western Civilization, and he's saying that the foundations of Greek culture and civilization came out of the Africans. George D.M. James explains it very clearly in The Stolen Legacy that that foundation that became Greece came out of the African experience. Dr. Shekhanta Diop has it detailed in his book, Civilization of Barbarism, that which the Greeks inherited was from the Africans, and they took it and developed a synthesis that became a Greek civilization. And even Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, in his book, Africa and the World, details how the Greeks came into the Nile Valley to master the culture and civilization that helped them develop a synthesis that became what we call Greek civilization. So we've got to see this African factor in history and how it impacts and influences others. And because of its significance, I have come up with a framework for analyzing history, and I refer to it as the pyramid analysis. And that pyramid analysis allows us to understand the development of a synthesis, a coming together of the different values in relationship to produce a new formulation. The thesis, or the foundation, is the African foundation, the African world experience, or what I call the Sun People's experience, based upon African values of humanism, caring and sharing, learning to live in settled communities. And that is the fundamental historical condition of the human family, the African history. But then all of a sudden, 50,000 BC, you have the emergence of something else and the ice of Europe. And the great Wormian Ice Age dominated Europe for 100,000 years, and after a period of evolution and transmutation and whatever developments took place, this European emerges, and the value system that comes out of it is European materialism. I refer to it as European greed, domination, male orientation, whereas the African value system is based upon the harmony of opposites, the complementarity of the male and the female principle, the centrality of the female principle because the female produces life. So you have this value system of harmony in conflict with this value system of domination. And the two, in conflict with each other, produce a synthesis. So you have to see this. The Europeans of the ice leaving the ice for warmer climates. They didn't go north for culture and civilization. There's no record of Europeans going north for anything except developing the war machines. But when they want culture and civilization, the Europeans come south. The ancient Greece of the north came into the southern Greeks. And then they related to Africans and developed a synthesis, an Africanized synthesis that helped them to develop culture and civilization. The same phenomenon happened with the Indo-European peoples coming in with Abraham. These people, Africanized Indo-Europeans, came into the African dimension, and the interrelationship between the two produced a synthesis, and that synthesis became Judaism. Just as the interrelationship between the Greeks and the Africans produced the synthesis, which became Greek, so-called Greek civilization. At a later period of time, 640 AD, the Arabs involved in barbarism in the Arabian Peninsula, just as the Greeks were involved in it in the Mediterranean, and the ancient Hebrews had their form of barbarism. They came into the Nile Valley, the Arabs invaded Egypt, and were there for 50, 60 years, and then the synthesis that they developed became Islam. An Africanized religious system called Islam, an Africanized religious system called Judaism, an Africanized religious system called Christianity, an Africanized religious system which was that which the Greeks left. All of those are synthesis developed syntheses developed out of the African experience as it interrelated with the European experience. So we've got to be able to see this African factor in order to be able to understand the history of the world. And so this formulation of pyramid consciousness was developed so we can see, and a circle should be seen as linking these areas together, because this formulation of the synthesis becomes important for us to understand later history. Because eventually, the foundation of some peoples, Africans, Native Americans, is interacted with European peoples in the New World, and a synthesis is developed called America. In an earlier period of time, an African synthesis out of Islam moves into Europe in a period where Europe is dominated by the Moors, Southern Europe, Iberian Peninsula, Italy, and a synthesis is developed between this Africanized experience and the European peoples interacting, and you get eventually the rise, second rise of Europe in the period they call the Renaissance. But of course, the catalyst is this Africanness as a foundation which produces and allows the European to produce these various syntheses. So this formulation becomes very important, and I've got to work on it in more detail so that people can begin to understand it. It makes sense because it allows us to see this enormous knowledge of African peoples in relationship to the pyramid and what I call caps. And what we have to do to master the knowledge is move to the top of the pyramid, to the capstone, and deal with the knowledge in terms of concepts, analyses, processes, and systems. Concepts is the grouping of knowledge, grouping of ideas and knowledge into a certain relationship. And so when we're talking about philosophy, we're talking about religion, we're talking about mathematics, we're talking about governmental relationships, we're talking about spirituality. Africans developed these concepts, and they were later passed on to other peoples who either accepted them, readjusted them, perverted them, and produced their own synthesis. So when we think of Judaism, when we think of Christianity, when we think of Greek civilization, when we think of Islam, we have to think of it being an African foundation that brought by in contact with European or Indo-European experience or Arab Semitic experience and producing a synthesis. But you can't understand this unless you look at the concepts. So for example, if in Catholicism, which is the synthesis that came out of the African experience, because the first Christian nation was in Africa, and then the Northern European or Central European relationship to the African Christianity produces what later became Catholicism. The major female figure of Catholicism is the Black Madonna, the Black Mother and Child. This concept cannot be understood if just seen in the European dimension. It only makes sense if the Black Madonna and Child is linked to the African concept of Isis and Horus, the first sustained and systematic mother and child that was developed by the Africans and existed for thousands of years, not only in Africa, but in the Mediterranean area and in the so-called Middle East. And you can't understand the concept of the Trinity, a three-in-one, a holy family, unless you understand the African holy family. The European later developed the synthesis, which was the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. But the African synthesis based upon the male principle. But the African foundation of that was the complementarity of the male and female principle, which was built around Isis, the mother, Aset, the mother. Isis is the Greek name, Aset is the African name. Osar is the African name, and Osiris is the Greek name. That's the mother and father principle. And then their synthesis would be the child, Horus, or Heru, the African name, Horus being the Greek name. And so that first holy family of Isis, Osiris, and Horus is the early trinity that was the foundation that the later trinities developed. But then you see the value system. The Africans had the complementarity of the male and female principle, and that's why I like the Newsweek article, because the Newsweek article has the complementarity of the male and the female principle. At least you have the two figures together. Of course, the idiom is around the snake, which is became symbolic of the evilness of women. That's not what the African heritage concept was. The women is the center of godliness because she produces birth of the human family, which is godly. So the early Judeo-Christians inherited a concept of the women as God and producing godliness, but they later converted the snake, not a symbol of authority or transmutation or transformation, but a symbol of evil, and they made the female the symbol of evil also. So we're talking about a synthesis, a negative synthesis that falls on the male side of the European value system, comes out of their deprivation, as opposed to falling on the African side of the harmony and the caring and sharing. But interesting enough, when Newsweek produced the article on the European factor, it just put a man on the cover, just the caveman. And so here you have the male and the female principle in connection with each other, and here you just have the male principle, the dominant male principle. So these two covers of Newsweek speaks volumes in terms of that concept that I'm talking about. But the concepts also relate to analyses. Analyses is how you view the knowledge. Concept is the grouping of ideas, knowledge in a certain relationship. Analysis is how you view the knowledge. And we're trying to say that the knowledge has to be viewed from an African perspective. If you're not grounded in the African perspective, as you look at the knowledge, you can't see it. You can't look at the Parthenon with European eyes. All you see is a beautiful pillared temple that has been called classic in the Greek dimension. But if you had African eyes to see the Parthenon, you would see that the Parthenon was inspired by the great pillared temple of Luxor, the greatest building of the ancient world, which was a pillared temple of the resurrection of the human spirit, the ability of the human spirit to move from a low level into a godly level. It was a university temple. But of course, the Parthenon in Greece had none of those dimensions in terms of morality and ethics and philosophy. It was a war memorial. A war memorial to what? To the principle of the barbarian. Albeit a civilized barbarian, because he came in contact with the African. It was the Parthenon is a memorial to the Greek victory of the homosexual warrior over the Persians. And so 490 or thereabout BC. So we have to understand the significance of contrasting African history with European history. But my basic contention is, as we learn the African timeline, that we've got to compare Africans with Africans. Because the Europeans are not even in history as history is being written. So we've got to master our history first. You compare the pre-dynastic period of Nubia with the dynastic period. Then you compare the dynastic period with the new developments under the Second Golden Age. Then you compare the Second Golden Age with the Great Golden Age of Amenhotep and Akhenaten and Queen T and Nefertiti. And then you compare their Golden Age with the Fourth Golden Age. Europeans are not a factor in history up to this point, and you've already covered thousands of years of African history. So the European doesn't come in any significant way until this period of time, and it's the Greeks. So we have to begin to start making our comparison, and you can't compare the Greeks who come in at the twilight of Kemet with the development of the pyramid. It's 2,000 plus years difference. And the Greeks have inherited the African value system, so there's no comparison. You'd be better off comparing the Greeks at this period of time with the modern Europeans than comparing the Greeks with the ancient Africans. So we've got to develop a certain sophistication in looking at our timeline and understanding it and how significant it is to looking at the rest of African history. Because in this period of the Fourth Golden Age, an important thing happened. I call it the period of the diffusion of African culture. As I mentioned, the first conflict of the 10 I mentioned is the African origin of humanity. The second conflict is the African evolution of society. The third conflict is the African cradle of Nile Valley civilization. And the fourth is the African diffusion of cultures. In other words, during this period of the African Golden Age of the Fourth Dynasty, the culture was diffused into other parts of Africa. You had an enormous development here in the Sudan and in Ethiopia taking place, but a refurbishing of that culture, and it's passing down to other parts of Africa and eventually emerging as a synthesis in this part of Africa, in Zimbabwe, in the great stone cities of Zimbabwe. Eventually, as the Europeans invade and with the Greeks and the Syrians invade and the Persians invade, the African culture goes further down into Africa, and it has a rebirth here in Nubia for another 1,000 years. Even as the Europeans sit here with the Greeks and with the Romans, the Africans still dominate this area and culture is still flourishing. And it starts to spread throughout other parts of Africa. It crosses this area through Lake Chad into the Niger River Valley. And it moves down from the Niger into the west coast of Africa and into the Congo River Valley. So you get the period of the diffusion of culture to other parts of Africa. So Ethiopia has a rebirth in terms of culture, which became the culture of Aksum, and the Ge'ez and the early literature of Ethiopia. The rebirth of Nile Valley civilization here becomes the period where heroic African queens dominated the Candace queens or the Kandasi queens, and they resisted the European incursions into this part of Africa, and for almost 1,000 years you had a rebirth of African civilization here. So we can extend Dr. Hilliard's timeline by developing a dispersion of culture around Africa, other parts of Africa, in the period after the 25th dynasty, after 700 AD, 700 BC. And that led to the foundations that became the city-states of the Niger River Valley, that became Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, that became the people of Ivory Coast and Ghana and the Yoruba. They all have roots that go back into the Nile Valley. Their cultures and civilization. The Ashanti king is reflective of the great pharaohs of Egypt. The Oni and the Obas of Nigeria are reflective of that philosopher king which the pharaoh symbolized. And their cultures have many things in common. Dr. Dieppe refers to the cultural unity of Africa because of this great system that was developed here and parts of the system spreading to other parts of the African continent. And we need to understand that. So when you look at the African continent, you need to see early migrations of the Africans millions of years ago over the continent, later migrations 100,000 years ago of the modern African over the continent, and then the cultural migrations 10,000 years ago, and certainly 1,000 years BC, this enormous migration of Nile Valley civilization and Nubian civilization to other parts of Africa. So you need to see the links. You need to see the great stone cities of Zimbabwe as linked to the great temple complex of Thebes and the great temple complex of Napata and Merowe, because they were, in these stone centers is where the societies of secrets or the learning processes were taking place, and where the leadership was learning to be the trustees of their people. And you need to understand that development with developments that took place in Mali and in Ghana and in Nigeria, so that the cultural unity of Africa, which is what Dieppe talks about in one of his later books, needs to be emphasized. This particular book by Dieppe is important. The concept, the cultural unity of black Africa, is what Dieppe cements with this particular book. He talks about the northern cradle being the European experience, the southern cradle being the African experience. What Professor Scobie, myself, and others, my wife, and a host of others, Dr. Hilliard and Dr. Noble, Dr. King, and others need to write is the cultural unity of African peoples in the world, not just the cultural unity of African peoples on the continent. Because eventually, with the slave trade system, Africans were taken out of Africa, and they peopled the Caribbean, and they peopled North America and South America, and they carried that culture. And there is still a cultural foundation that's very real in the values. We've got to look at the concepts and the values, and in certain symbols and certain institutions, such as the images that were maintained. Dr. Ivan Van Sertima has done us a great service by talking about the Africans in America. And certainly these images of the kings of the ancient world in Mexico, in the Yucatan, among the Native American populations there, reflect the African presence. In fact, we owe Dr. Van Sertima a great debt because he has produced an enormous volume called The African Presence in America. They Came Before Columbus. And so, again, that is one of those conflicts when we talk about the African diffusion of culture and civilization. We've even got to talk about it going into the New World, and that becomes difficult for the Europeans to accept. They have no problems in accepting that the Vikings might have come across and for a few minutes might have stayed in North America and gone to the bathroom and then gotten their ships and gone home. They'll accept that as a reality. But Africans who helped build temples and pyramids, helped to lay the foundation for cities, helped develop philosophy, writing, helped develop hieroglyphs, cannot be given any credence in terms of their contribution. So that's why I'm saying we, as African peoples, have to begin to write the history. We cannot leave it to the Europeans, because we'll run into conflict with the question of origin. They cannot accept an African origin, but science tells us that there's an African origin. They can't accept an African evolution of society. They want to put the evolution in other parts of the world. But the scientific information is establishing 100,000 years ago that humankind went into a rapid revolutionary process of developing and finding itself and laying the foundations for modern scientific culture. And so the third process, the African cradle of civilization, and that particular ecology of the Nile, is our reality. But of course, the European says that we have no history, we have no culture, and he wants to claim our history and our culture, but we have to fight to make sure that it's taken back. And the fourth aspect is the diffusion of African culture into Africa, and later into Europe through Greece, and then out into the Indus Valley, Mesopotamia, and eventually on into the far reaches of Asia. And so when we do deal with that, we have to talk about the stolen legacy of the Greeks in relationship to the Africans. We have to talk about the African heritage of the Judeo-Christian Islamic experience, and then that key factor of Africa in Islam has to be dealt with, and that becomes an important part of our history, because in the African Middle Ages, because I divide history up as opposed to Dr. Hilliard's timeline, when I deal with the African timeline for history, I deal with what I call 6 eras. One is the prehistorical era, going back millions of years, and then coming up to the classical period, which is the civilization of the Nile Valley 10,000 years ago. And then you have the diffusion of this culture, 2000 BC into other parts of the world. And then you have the Middle Ages, which I date from 500 or so AD, in which the culture spreads significantly to West Africa, and you get the foundation of Ghana, later Mali and Songhai developing, the foundations of the Yoruba and the Akan civilization in that middle period. And in the later middle period, Islam becomes an important factor. And it's important at that point for us to understand that the Africans Africanized Islam. They did not accept an Arab version of Islam, and Islam became an important factor of culture and civilization in Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, around the city-states of Jenny, Mapi, Gao, and Timbuktu, and into Nigeria around Sokoto, Kano, and others, because the Africans maintained their values of harmony and caring and sharing, while they accepted the overall belief of the one God concept of Islam. They did not take Islamic culture, which would have forced them to take the female principle and put the female principle 5 steps behind or in purdah, under a veil, etc. The African has always allowed the female principle to be a major factor in their cultural development. That's why the Queen Mother concept among African peoples such as the Akan of Ghana becomes important, because in an Arab culture, the Queen Mother concept would have been crushed and destroyed under the domination of male preeminence. But the Queen Mother concept of rulership is definitely related to the African concept of rulership coming out of the Nile, where the goddess Nefertiti is carrying the stool of rulership on her head, or you may find the goddess Hathor or Isis or Nephthys carrying the rule, the seat of power on their head, because it is through the female that the line of rulership passes. Now this is why we can make a distinction as to who built the cultures of the ancient world in reference to the Nile Valley, because the principles of the harmony of the male and female principle and the centrality of the female principle is built into these cultures. Arabs could not have built a culture and civilization that has, for example, as Ramses built in Abu Simbel, a temple to the male principle, himself representing the male rulership and Amun representing the male godship. And near that temple, or next to it, complementary to it, is the female temple to his great wife Nefertari, and to the female god concept of Hathor. In other words, so you have the complementarity of 2 temples built next to each other, representing the male and the female principle. That's why we know Africans built these things. Europeans have a concept of male domination. The Semites have a concept of male domination. And so it is clear that if you have a culture that puts the center of it, the female principle, makes the female goddess, makes the females rulers, makes the female the preserver of the culture, meaning the symbol of Ma'at is the female with the feather. And in other words, clearly the Africans are letting people know who are the transmitters of the values. The European, centered around this male domination, has suppressed the female even to this day. If you ask the Pope whether women have a role to play in the church, he's still falling on ancient European caveman doctrine that there's no special role of the women in the work of God. And so we need to understand from whence we came in terms of our tradition. So that means now still trying to deal with these 10 areas of conflict: the African origin of humanity, the African evolution of society, the African cradle of Nile Valley civilization, the African diffusion of these cultures to other parts of Africa and then to other parts of the world, the African stolen legacy of the Greeks, number 5, number 6, the African heritage of the Judeo-Christian Islamic experience, number 7, the African factor in Islam. We need to make a clear distinction between the Arab factor in Islam, the African factor in Islam, the Asian factor in Islam, in order to be able to understand the development of Islam. And because that African factor helped to develop that golden age of the Western Sudan, and it was linked to the second rise of Europe. And then that second rise of Europe becomes important. The first rise of Europe is in that dynasty of the 25th dynasty of the Africans from Nubia. You're talking about 500 BC. Then Europe, after flowering with the synthesis of the Greeks and the synthesis of the Romans and eventually the synthesis of the Christians, Europe flowered, but around 400 AD, 400 BC, 400 AD and 500 AD, Europe floundered with the invasions of the barbarians from the west, from the east, and from the north. Rome went into decline, and for 1,000 years, Europe was in its period of dislocation called the Dark Ages. We call them the White Ages. Mm-hmm. And in this period of the White Ages, where the barbarian dominated, Europe had very few periods of glory. One period of glory that they hold to during this period of 1,000 years was the development, 900 or so AD, of the kingdom in Germany of Charlemagne. It's the only thing the Europeans hang on to is Charlemagne. And Charlemagne was one of those barbarians who did not understand human development, had little education, but was a valiant warrior. Africans at the time of the so-called European Dark Ages was moving into another age of great development, another golden age. And that golden age was the golden ages throughout Africa. And that's why it's important for us to understand. At the time that Charlemagne was on the throne, the foundation for the African great golden age of the middle period was laid. The golden age of the city-states and empires of the Niger River Valley. The golden ages of the kingdoms that became the flourishing kingdoms of Nigeria and Ghana and the Cameroons. The golden age of the development of the kingdoms in Angola, etc., as well as the city-states of Zimbabwe and the Swahili city-states along the coast. This was all taking place in this Middle Age, where I date the great African golden age of the middle period, 1000 AD to 1500 AD. This flourishing was taking place everywhere in the sun among some people, not only in Africa. You had the Swahili city-states being developed here, Mombasa and others, Kilwa being a part of that. You had the inner African empires and kingdoms of Monopatapa around the great Zimbabwe stone cities. You had the Christian kingdom of Ethiopia developing in the 1200s. King Lalibela built 12 stone churches into the ground, monuments to African ingenuity to resist the waves of invading Arabs. A great Christian synthesis was developed here in Ethiopia around Coptic Christianity, which became Aksum, and which was built on the foundation of Aksum and others. And so you had a synthesis of African Islam developed around the Swahili, a synthesis of African Christianity developed in Ethiopia, a synthesis of West African Islam developed in the Niger River Valley, a synthesis of of traditional African nations developed in Nigeria and other parts of the world. So we have to understand the significance of what was happening. Africanized Islam also passed through North Africa and up into Europe. And this, the Iberian Peninsula, developed the first European modern awakening, because for 800 years it was dominated by African Arab peoples called Moors. And so this synthesis was developed in North Africa. And similar syntheses were developed in other parts of the world. Eventually, in India, Buddhism and others became a predominant part of the development. That becomes part of a synthesis that has an African foundation. Buddha is always depicted, the most severe and real Buddhas, as black. Full lips, a full nose, hair tight, and of course, even as this culture passed east, and became part of the culture of China and Japan around the martial arts. We want to claim an African foundation for it because when we went to the Great Lodge of Luxor, we saw African martial arts on the Great Wall of Luxor, and that dates back 2000 BC. But a synthesis also occurred, as Van Sertima talked about, in the New World. Relationship of Africans to Native Americans produced in this period of the Sun People's Golden Age, 1000 AD to 1500 AD, the temples of the Mayan Peninsula. It also produced culture and civilization of the high Andes, the Incas, developing their stone cities in the sky. A synthesis was developed in India and in Indonesia similarly. So what we found at 1000 to 1500 AD, Sun People were in a golden age. And then we have to say to ourselves, what happened? What happened to change that? And that's when we come to this other period, the 8th period of conflict that we're talking about, the African underdevelopment and European development. And Walter Rodney symbolizes that in his book called How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. In other words, the Europeans locked into Europe in their so-called Dark Ages, attempted to get around the African Islamic world that dominated from the Atlantic Ocean through the Indian Ocean on into the Pacific Ocean. And in order for the Europeans to get involved in development of the world, they started to sail around Africa in order to make connections to the east and also to the mythical Ethiopian kingdom where a King Prester John existed. So the Europeans, once they tried to consolidate their little presence here, Henry and the king in Portugal, and eventually Ferdinand and Isabel, they began to sail down the coast of Africa, and their minds was blown when they got to Africa, where the gold and the diamonds existed, and they began to set up forts along this strip of Africa. And symbolic of that is 1482, when they established a fort at Elmina on the coast of Ghana. And they were interested not in Africans, they were interested in gold. And that began, unfortunately, a process where the Europeans systematically, when I was dealing with CAPS, I was talking about concepts, analysis, processes, and systems. These processes of his moving out of Europe, looking to link up with trade around the world, and eventually allowed him to establish a system. Once these so-called discoveries were made and he used his military might to destroy people who innocently thought that he was there for trade, he was able to establish a system of domination. That system, established after the 1500s, became what I call the system of European world domination, European world materialism, and I date that from 1482 AD to 1536 AD, and I call it the 50-year turning point of history, when accidents of history allowed the European to move on center stage and push everybody else off and establish his dominance over whole continents. In other words, before this time, before 1492 or 82, the Europe was what I call land poor, resource poor, people poor. Land poor because all of the land in Europe was under the domination of the feudal lords, so there was no land for real development, or the church. And resource poor because Europe does not have rich deposits of gold and diamonds and precious metals. And people's poor because in the 1300s the bubonic plague wiped out much of the European population in many areas. So Europe was going under a severe period of chaos and destruction. That's why they had to fall back on Charlemagne, 900 AD, because he was the only light they had. In the period after him, the church, Europeans went into the dislocation of having invasions from the north. Again, that northern factor. And that's why we can't just talk about the caveman going back thousands of years ago. We just go back 1,000 years, we can talk about the Vikings. 900 AD to 1100 AD. This northern factor visited death on Europe. Coming out of Denmark and Norway and Sweden, they vamped on the Europeans in Central Europe and also in the western part of Europe. And for 200 years, the Viking raids devastated Europe. And Europe made an adjustment, a negative synthesis. In other words, this ice factor came in, beat up on the poor other Europeans, And so they adjusted to the war machinery of the Vikings, and they became on a war footing themselves. And so immediately after 1100, after the Viking raids, you get the period of the European insanity around the Crusades. So for the next 400 years, you get the various crusades in which the Europeans are on a war footing, leaving Europe, ports in Italy, and sailing to the east to take back Jerusalem. These Europeans, most of whom never became serious Christians, and only became Christians yesterday, and only became Christians through a group process where one Lord might say he's a Christian and then get all those people together, tell them to kneel down and say you're all Christian. But there was no belief, there was no morality, there was no value system. The inherited African 42 commandments that became the 10 commandments wasn't real for these folks. But they were latter-day Christians. In other words, they bopped into Christianity late, and they were sailing east for booty. They wasn't sailing east for a spiritual foundation. They were sailing east for whatever booty they could get. And so you had the insanity of the Crusades, the First Crusade, Second Crusade, Third Crusade, Fourth Crusade. And it reached its ultimate insanity in the Fifth Crusade, when ships were leaving the Mediterranean, ports in Italy, with the children of Europe, tens of thousands of children. The men could not save Jerusalem, so now the children were asked to save Jerusalem. But the tragedy of the European value system of death around materialism is that these children, leaving these ports in Europe, were sold under contract to to Arab slaves before they left Europe. In other words, the Fifth Crusade, the Children's Crusade, was the ultimate tragedy of the Europeans selling their children into Arab enslavement. And it's a much deeper thing than that, and I think it's too deep for this story for me to deal with, but I did run across a book that lays out some of this called The Jews of Germany, a story of 16 centuries by Marvin Lowenthal. And it deals with the trade, the Middle Eastern trade in Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire and the 600 and 700 AD that eventually became dominated by the Syrians, the Lebanese, and Jews, and eventually was called the Jewish trade. And it was this trade that enslaved, the major part of this trade was slaves, people, Europeans, Central Europeans, being sold into Arab slavery, and these Europeans were called Slavs. So the word slave comes from the designation of Central and Eastern Europeans that were sold into Arab slavery. And so we need, when we have our discussion on slavery, and the people want to talk about Africans being involved in enslavement, we need to go back to the root of it all. But if we do, we have to be prepared for another conflict. Just as we're conflicting over the origin of humankind, the evolution of humankind, the cradle of human civilization, the diffusion of human civilization, when we talk about enslavement and we get to the roots of enslavement, the European value system of death, domination, and material, I call it the 3 Ds, domination, destruction, and death, as opposed to the African 3 Cs of communal, cooperative, and collective development. But we've got to tap into these things because this information allows us to pull together things systematically. Now, the person who helped me develop a systems approach, and all of these accidents of history, 1482, the Europeans coming to the coast of Ghana, and then hearing about sailing west into the Caribbean, and eventually Columbus and others sailed west and they got into the Caribbean. Later, when they discovered the lands of the New World, they set up colonies and developed an imperial system of exploitation of African peoples and native peoples as well as European peoples. And so a whole world system developed. Now, Emmanuel Wallerstein has a book called The Modern World System, and the foundation of that is the international slave trading. And that's an area where we have to deal with the new map that has been developed. And that new map will help us deal with the devastation of the European slave trading on African peoples. But the important thing is that Europe, at the period that we're talking about, was land poor, resource poor, people poor. With the new discoveries, Europe becomes land rich, people rich, and resource rich in unbelievable dimensions. With the mentality of exploitation, they're able to set up a system of domination based around the enslavement of African peoples that lays the foundation for European culture. So what we've been trying to establish is that the enormity of history that our brothers, Dr. Diop and Dr. Ben and Dr. Chancellor Williams and Dr. W. Du Bois have been talking about is so fundamental that we have to begin to seriously rewrite the history for ourselves. Because if we do not, this truth, which is so devastating to the European concept of superiority, will not reach the light of day. So the imperative of African peoples is to take control. And taking control means rewriting the history of the world to reflect the African truth.
Great.
Almanac, and Thomas Jefferson still poo-poos this African achievement. But eventually, what goes around comes around. And Thomas Jefferson was forced eventually to pay homage to Benjamin Banneker, because it was Banneker who, and this is a comic book which deals with this episode in history, which is very significant. It was Benjamin Banneker who was part of the team of people that the Americans had commissioned to lay the foundations for a new capital. They were attempting to build a new Jerusalem in the New World, and they commissioned a French architect, L'Enfant, to outline the plans. He pulled together a team of people to help him, surveyors, engineers, architects, and one of them was Benjamin Banneker. And Banneker was a part of that team that laid the foundations for Washington, but L'Enfant got disgusted, the Frenchman, because these Americans were really only interested in making a dollar out of slavery, and Washington and Jefferson were faced with the problem of L'Enfant leaving. He finally left, and he took the plans with him. So they had a dilemma of what to do. They would have had a mud hole on the Potomac if it wasn't for this black man who had in his mind, in his computerized mind, the plans that were developed for the city, and he redrew them. So our contribution is enormous. Here, this brother resisted, challenged Thomas Jefferson, the greatest of Americans, and then he was the one who laid the foundation for the city that Jefferson and Washington wanted to call their capital. So the contribution of black folk continually throughout the history has to be developed, and it's a heroic contribution. Even in enslavement, even in our struggles, it is enormous. But after 1800, something happened. The blacks in America who stayed in America and got their freedom began to purchase their people out of slavery at such a fast rate that it scared the American population. 1790, the American had a census. The first census in America had 90,000 free blacks, 360,000 slave blacks. 20% of the black population was free. And over the next 10 years, this free black population continued to buy their people out of slavery. It scared white folks so that they began to plan and plot and conspire again to block them and put them back into semi-slavery or get rid of them, because they were inspired by the Haitian Revolution. And that inspiration produced the Prosser Rebellion in 1800. The white folks really had an excuse to get scared, because here black folks were talking about taking over, killing white folks, and going back to and joining Haiti. So what they did was they attacked the free blacks, and they said the free black population would be an inspiration to the slave black population, the enslaved black population, so let's destroy the free black population. And after 1803, Virginia passed legislation that any free black coming into Virginia had to leave. And but that didn't stop black folks from continuing purchasing their people out of slavery. And that's why we have to get into the history with an African perspective. I discovered a book by Carter G. Woodson, our great historian. And it blew my mind because it was called 13,000 Blacks with Slaves from the census of 1830. And I said, wow, how could this be? And but then I began to study it and began to see, why did those blacks have slaves? And to come to find out that blacks had ingeniously gotten around this whole system of Virginia forcing free blacks to leave. When they continued to purchase their people out of slavery, instead of going down to the courthouse and finally manumitting them, getting their freedom papers, they didn't do the final step because they wanted to keep the family intact. So they kept them on the books as slaves, but you can bet that they were not slaves. But many blacks, as a matter of principle, said to hell with Virginia. And they picked themselves up in covered wagons. They went to Indiana, Ohio, to establish a new life, because they, as a matter of principle, they weren't going to keep any of their people on paper slaves. And so you have this enormous document of 13,000 blacks with slaves, which looks like an indictment against black people, but it's a tribute to our ability to resist by any means necessary, even beating them in their legal games. So we have to understand that 1800 is an important turning point, because at that point you had Paul Cuffey and people going to Sierra Leone. At that point you had the Maroons leaving Jamaica, going to Canada to take the place of the blacks, but then they got disgusted with being up there. The Maroons got disgusted with being in Nova Scotia, so they were leaving to join the blacks in Sierra Leone. At 1800, you had the Prasa Rebellion, inspired by the Haitian Rebellion. 1800, you had the beginning of the foundations of the black church movement. Absalom Jones and Richard Allen getting disgusted with white folks and walking out of the church, and then establishing an African society that became the foundation of the African church. So this resistance, this type of resistance at all levels, whether petitioning and protesting, whether setting up your own separate thing and leaving, whether rebelling with arms, was a constant. And we need to see this. Now, my basic theory, and the glory is so important for me because I developed a theory around this, that it appears that the greatest resistance and intensity occurs during periods of war, either the struggles leading up to the war, during the war, and after the war. And so if we look at the great war periods in America, the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, the First World War, the Second World War, our great periods of activity occur in those 15 to 20 years after. And after the Revolutionary War, the foundations of the black church were established. The black fraternal order came out of Prince Hall, who came from Barbados, demanded a charter for the Americans. They wouldn't give it to him, even though he helped the Americans in the war. He had to go to England to get the charter. But the foundations of the black fraternal order, the foundations of the black church, the foundations of the black school, the African free schools were established in this period. The foundation of a black movement of going out of America, establishing themselves in Africa occurred. And the foundation of struggle, meaning with arms, was cemented. And it became so intense that the Europeans became frightened, and they were trying to push the black people out of America. So the colonization movement started. The Liberian movement got started with free blacks wanting to leave anyway, but then the white folks said, we'll pay for you to leave because we don't want you here inspiring blacks to revolt. So that the movement for Liberia occurred in that, had its foundation in that early 1800 period and manifested itself later. And blacks continued to revolt. You had, in 1822, you had the Vesey Rebellion, where blacks were trying to leave Charleston and go on to join Haiti. And then, of course, you had the Great Rebellion of Nat Turner in 1831. After that, white folks said enough. They said, we ain't going to teach black folks to read. We're not even going to let them even worship in their own churches. They got to worship with us because we can't trust what they're doing in church. Because most of these free blacks was in their churches praying for God to deliver them, but then they said, we got to get organized to make the delivery work ourselves. And so Nat Turner was one of them. So after 1831, they really stopped putting the clamps down, but then blacks resisted. And so you had struggles that went on. You had a key white individual involved in helping to raise black folks. You had John Brown. But before John Brown, you had David Walker, who wrote his tracts that said black folks need to take up arms and revolt. That's 1829. So that there was, and then you, of course, you had Frederick Douglass fighting his way out of slavery in that period of time, and then leading the struggle, the abolitionist struggle. So that there is a continuous struggle that reaches its fulfillment in the Civil War. And the Civil War is an enormous explosion, and white folks were caught just as were in the Revolutionary War. They wanted to keep it a white man's war. But when it came to crunch time, after 2 years of keeping it a white man's war, the blacks were organized initially to fight in the war from the opening gun. In fact, a black leader, Robert Small, from South Carolina, took his ship, the pilot, and brought it over to the Union lines and continued to fight in the war. So blacks were ready to fight, but then Lincoln disbanded the regiment. And it wasn't until after 2 years of white folks dying like flies that they said they better use their black strength in order to win the war. And that's how you got the Emancipation Proclamation. It's really a war document to arm blacks. But still, there was this belief that blacks could not fight. And black folks with arms was a terrifying thing. So what they did was, black folks, like Frederick Douglass said, you can't win the war without us. And eventually, they pushed to have the Massachusetts 54th established. And the Massachusetts 54th was designed specifically to be a testing ground as to whether blacks had the will, whether they had the ability and the capability of struggle to win their own freedom. And so when you see the movie is part of a whole historical dimension. But people are criticizing in terms of, well, they picked up the flag, and I don't like that, or the white man died with them, and they showed the white man. No, you got to see the sweep of black history and resistance to understand where that fits. And the white man is only an instrument of a whole process of black folks bonding themselves together and struggling, and that bonding continued with 200,000+ of them fighting in the war and winning their own freedom. So, and when they came out of the war, the explosion of activity around these freedom fighters and their family was so enormous that no people in the history of the world have the history of black folks after the Civil War. No people have a history of coming out of bondage and building like black folks built. Schools, businesses, organizing whole state systems. It was against the law for them to read and write, but they still were able to find those people who had mastered reading and writing and put together systems of constitutional development that helped set up the public school system for the South, that helped set up the public welfare system for the South, that helped set up a South that, or American model of helping all peoples, not just the rich folks that had property. So that the role that black folks played in the post-Civil War period is enormous. Now, I appreciate it. I'm being able to appreciate it more and more because when I went down and I found my grandfather's tomb after they messed with me in that Alex Haley incident, where the white folks told me we bought the history of Alex book, and we don't have to deal with it as a truth, and we don't have to deal with the truth of African history. This is after 2 weeks of being down there helping Alex with the roots thing. I got disgusted. I said I got to make a pilgrimage to my grandfather's grave. So I left Alex and them in Savannah, flew to Atlanta, rented the car, rushed across the Georgia countryside. I'd never been in rural Georgia, but I had to get to my grandfather's grave. Just something told me, because my psyche had been devastated by these Europeans. And the only way to reconstitute was a spiritual connection with my grandfather, who I never even seen, didn't even know about. Got to the grave site, there was this church that they had built, this clapperboard church. And on the cornerstone was two Jeffries. One was Jesse Jeffries, my grandfather, and the other was S.L. Jeffries. I later learned that that was his brother. He was born in slavery in 1865. Jesse Jeffries was born when I found his tombstone, which was an obelisk. He was born August the 10th, 1868, at the birth of the 14th Amendment. And the obelisk had a Masonic symbol on it. And I later learned that he was a master of the lodge in that area. So here, these blacks coming out of slavery had their churches that they built, their schoolhouse that they built to teach their children, and their lodges and their institutions to develop their leadership. And so that's the grounding that allows us to continue the struggle. Even crippled by enslavement, we were able to continue the struggle in enormous proportions. That's why white folks fear us. And they fear, most of all, the bonding of black men as the instrument and the catalyst to protect the black family. So we have to begin to seriously understand that. And the devastations that have taken place with black men over the last couple of decades is part of that process, to destroy that black young man, because he is the catalyst for protecting that black family. So we have to see our international struggle, and we are moving into a 50-year turning point of African people's victory since 1945, with the collapse of the European system. And Du Bois details this in his book. The European system has been trying to keep control of African peoples, but the revolutions keep coming. The revolution in China, the revolution in India, the revolution in Egypt, the revolution in Sudan, the revolution in Guinea, the revolution in Ghana, the revolution in Guinea-Bissau, the revolution in Zimbabwe. All of those are part of the continuous struggle of African peoples to establish their foundation and their system for the 21st century. So what is happening around the enormity of the African experience is that we are laying the foundation for getting prepared for the 21st century, a new African dignity and an African renaissance.
Thank you.